From small bird cages to sprawling modern complexes, aviaries are a common sight in zoos. They house an extremely wide variety of animals, from the smallest songbirds, wading birds, to leopards who love to climb. Welcome everyone to this Planet Zoo tutorial showing off everything there is to know about aviaries and precisely how exactly are realistic aviaries built easily. Whether you are new to building or have thousands of hours, it can't hurt to go over the basic tips for building. I'm not talking about the ABC guide for franchise habitats. This is mesh, and it's a world of pain. Tip 1. Patience. I cannot stress this enough. Patience is the key to a successful aviary, especially if you're eyeing up those giant flight cages or modern aviary complexes. Aviaries and custom mesh laying is tedious, dreadfully tedious. Sure, some people like me can build a pretty complex aviary in under 90 minutes, but are you a fast builder? This is where the importance of patience comes in, except that an aviary may take several hours, days, or God forbid, weeks to complete. Take your time, break it up into bite-sized pieces so you don't get burnt out, or just delete the entire aviary because it's going nowhere. Tip 2. Start simple. We've all been there, browsing the likes of Pinterest for the ideal zoo inspiration, and there you find it, the perfect aviary. This amazing modern aviary with all these curves, an immersive walk-through trail, and the frame is gorgeous. Stop, just stop. You know yourself you probably can't build it, but it can't hurt to try, right? Of course, but start small, start simple. Not every zoo has a giant aviary, nor a need for it. Simple mesh boxes are a great way to start off, fast and easy to build for all skill levels. Work your way up with some historic bird cages and the like until you have the confidence and skill to try something amazing. Tip 3. Happy symmetry. Symmetry is aesthetically pleasing, and to builders in Planet Zoo, symmetry means a happy building session. While this doesn't apply to every single aviary design, those aviaries that benefit from rounded segments are actually easier than they look. If you design an aviary using the Angle Snap tool, you only need to design one mesh segment, allowing you to simply duplicate one side and finish the aviary in a matter of seconds. Tip 4. Workshop cheating. Of course, not everyone has the patience or time required to build complicated aviaries. Some people may call it cheating or ashamed to use other people's work, but there is absolutely nothing wrong with grabbing a blueprint or two from the workshop. Whether it's a simple bird cage or a massive walk-through aviary, the workshop has plenty to choose from. We have established content creators such as Caesar Creates and ZSH Plays who've uploaded several of their fantastic aviaries with their unique designs, or my aviary collection as well. Just for this tutorial alone, I have uploaded over 20 real-life aviaries specifically for you to use. So that was a simple overview of some tips for aviaries. Now let's head over to the building menu and see what materials you want to gather before building. Mesh, specifically the mesh fence panel, is the most obvious building piece for any kind of aviary or enclosure netting. You have two varieties here, 1 and 2. Type 1 is chain link mesh, one of the most common designs for mesh in a zoo setting, where type 2 is cage mesh, often used in smaller cages or small bird aviaries. There's also another kind of mesh material you can use, the Oceania Net Flat from the Oceania DLC. You might want to use this over the base game mesh if you're wanting to see the mesh from far away as the Oceania Net remains visible. Handy for extremely large aviary complexes, however you are limited in sizes here. Also related to the mesh aspect of aviaries are cables. Older realistic aviaries I know use the European DLC cables, which are limited to 1 meter length. resulting in an insane piece count for larger aviaries. Instead, now we have the Zookeeper DLC's metal wire cable coming in 1, 2 and 4 metre lengths, improving the overall texture and reducing piece counts where accessible. Cabling can also be used in other metal-like materials, which brings us to the Australia DLC. In the Australia DLC, we have the fantastic metal beams and rods, especially useful for a wide variety of aviaries. They can be used for cabling in larger aviaries, aviary supports like metal pylons, and even full aviary frames. Just keep note the colours of the metal beams do not match the metal rods. You will have to compensate for the brighter beams. Got a really large aviary to build or something a little more industrial? The New World architecture theme with its girder painted horizontal pieces makes short work of any large aviary. While a lot of aviaries are indeed metal, basic aviaries may be made of wood. There are quite a few options for wood here, many of which can be combined together to create some interesting designs. The most diverse set we have would be the Indonesian wood set from the Tropical DLC. Wood poles, planks and beams are all highly useful, even for mimicking metal when used in darker colours. Other wood includes the Conservation DLC slapped cladding beams, the East Asia theme paint timber columns, and various other base game wood such as the Planet Zoo brace round painted. The last essential building piece for aviaries is the plaster wall panels from the base game. A lot of aviary designs are set on a plaster or say concrete foundation, providing a realistic touch to lower parts of your aviaries. We've talked about what you need to build an aviary, now let's jump into what you want to actually see. How do we actually build an aviary? I have 6 builds prepared for this tutorial, taking you from the most basic aviary builds to some of the most complicated, gradually increasing difficulty to match skill levels. First we head to the Adelaide Zoo in Australia, where we can find a row of simple native bird aviaries. These are extremely basic rectangle aviaries made of a plaster foundation, metal rods and mesh panels. These basic aviaries at the Adelaide Zoo provide homes for small Australian birds such as spinifex pigeon, little lorikeet, orange-bellied parrots and crested bellbirds. Building aviaries like these is extremely easy. First, a plaster foundation of 8 meters long and 4 meters wide is built to provide the shape of the aviary. 2 meter long metal rods, coloured a dark grey, are added to the corners and centre of the plaster walls. Angle snap and simply duplicate dragging allows you to be precise in your movement of these rods. The metal rod is then duplicated down to the horizontal axis and changing it to a 4 meter long rod to create the mesh trim along the plaster walls. We can use the 4 meter rods along the length of the aviary, then switch back to the 2 meter rods for the width. You can now either do the exact same for the roof frame at the top, or simply duplicate the lower section we just built for a quick task. An important part of the roof is to create the central rod connecting the front and back. Now mesh placement is also pretty easy. Double click the top metal rod and add a large mesh panel. For example, I went with the 4 meter by 2 meter variant. Fill in the gaps, keeping the mesh chain link as neatly as possible. The mesh will turn dark or visibly out of alignment when the mesh panels aren't lined up properly. Later on though, we will find this isn't too important. However, with such an easy aviary build, we can practice the technique of neat mesh laying without much frustration. Like the roof, all sides of the aviary are meshed the exact same way. You can rotate the larger mesh pieces. To fit the gaps or try a smaller variant of mesh. And there we go, a really easy aviary, perfect for smaller birds, built in say 10 minutes real time. I have timed all these builds to give you an idea how long it'll be at the minimum for you. It's not fancy, it's not the most visibly appealing aviary, but it is realistic and an easy aviary to house those stag bird props that surely everyone can manage. For a zoo with some history, perhaps a classic European city zoo, you may want to include some of those classic themed aviaries that surely belong back in the 19th century. Let's head to Europe, precisely the Artis Zoo in Amsterdam, where we can find some fantastic examples of historic bird cages adapted to modern welfare standards. With larger aviaries on hand, you want to break up the build so you're not overwhelmed. The key aviary structure of its vertical section and the curved roof is what we want to focus on, building just one segment at a time. Start with the curved roof, this way we get the width of the aviary first. To do this, grab one of the primitive arch shapes. These 2D arch shapes are incredibly useful for creating shapes in aviaries. The arch shape allows us to create a custom sized arch where the curved metal rods, for example, may be too small or large. The arch shape arch with 2 arches to form a half circle is the first step. Then 1 meter Australia metal beams are placed on the outer arch shape and duplicated as closely as you can manage. Delete those arches now and there's a nice even arch, perfect for a historic aviary. Then 4 meter metal beams placed on the flat ground are added for the vertical frame. Could be looking at roughly a 6 to 8 tall meter aviary, which allows some free flight for birds inside. Next, build up the segment to prepare for the mesh placement. A group of 3 meter metal beams made of a 2 meter and a 1 meter metal beam is duplicated horizontally at various points along the curved roof, creating joins for the mesh. The vertical mesh section with a lower metal beam, a plaster wall foundation and some mesh panels is easy enough. For the curved mesh, this may appear slightly intimidating. Fear not though, turn on angle snap and double click one of the metal beams. Choose a 1 meter by 2 meter mesh panel and rotate it to line up nicely. A tiny little duplication of the mesh here fills in the 1 meter by 3 meter space. Prepare for some slightly tedious work now. You want to do this for every 1 meter metal beam along the curved roof. You could try to group the mesh and try to angle snap it, but the alignment will surely just be as tedious, if not more. It's a simple process regardless. There's little overlap on the mesh panels if you laid out all the metal beams correctly. Once done, group the entire aviary segment. With the group, duplicate the group and drag it along so that the metal beams connect to each other. You can do this as many times as you want, whether it's for a 6 meter long aviary or a 40 meter long aviary. The only thing left to take care of is the ends of the aviary. Start with more metal beams, creating this structure. See the orange editing group? Yeah, you don't want that. Ensure all the pieces are not in the aviary group, rather on their own. Do this especially before you start doing the mesh work. Some diagonal metal beams are placed as well here. Some manual alignment is easy enough, using the longer metal beams, then change into a shorter beam. If you haven't yet grouped the metal beams for the end segment, do so now. Mesh works here is a tiny bit more involved. Grab the largest mesh piece and fill in as much as you can before it exits the metal beams. Fill in the central gap with another big piece, then swap to the smallest half-a-meter length piece. Carefully fill in the small gaps while trying to stick to the existing mesh layout. A tiny bit sticking out or not touching the metal beam at all doesn't really matter. Don't feel pressured it has to be absolutely perfect, but don't also rush this so that it looks like a maze of mesh, though, as this will just look messy. Once the mesh is all placed, highlight the entire end segment group and simply drag it to the opposite end. And that's a historic Aviary all complete. Moving on to some of the largest and most impressive aviaries found in zoos. Walk-through flight cages are iconic sites in certain zoos, where huge free flight spaces are offered for many birds, and guests even get the chance to walk through the aviary. Some famous examples include the Scripps and Owens aviaries at the San Diego Zoo, the 1904 World Fair flight cage at the St. Louis Zoo, and the Great Flight Cage at the Melbourne Zoo. We are going to look at the St. Louis Aviary. At 70 metres long, 25 metres wide and 15 metres high, this is an impressive aviary. While such a large free-flight aviary seems a daunting task, if we follow the same method as the Artist Zoo bird cages, it is actually a lot more simple than it looks. The key sections here, if we break it up again, is a central frame which can be duplicated, then curved sections at each end. The material of choice for this large aviary will be the girder beams, where the starting point is the top of the aviary this time around. Building from the top allows you to build downwards, having the control of the curve of the frame, ensuring you remain at the correct height. As the measurements for this aviary are near the exact measurements found online. Definitely not as simple as the Artist bird cages, where it has a curved roof and vertical side. The St. Louis Aviary is a custom sloped frame, which is built by hand, looking at image references. 2 metre long girder beams are gradually pointed downwards as the frame continues to the ground, ensuring the curve is steady and important so there are no sudden sharp points in the frame. Like the smaller bird cages, the aviary is being built in sections for the central aviary. Duplicating to the opposite side allows the aviary frame to appear identical. Hand building for these kind of designs on both sides is not recommended at all. A section of metal beams, plaster walls and girder beams are used to build up the aviary structure, preparing the frame to have mesh placed, but also break points to hide mesh inside. While some may think you need to manually align mesh using the 2D arc-shape trick, it turns out you don't need to unless you are working with impossible curves. A walk-through flight cage, for example, is still mainly built on the angle snap grid, which makes mesh placement a whole lot easier. Onto the central frame meshwork, the method of the double-click the girder beams, rotating larger pieces of mesh with angle snap is used yet again. Sure, a tiny bit tedious, but the large space inside the girder beams allows any slight overlapping or mesh errors to be easily hidden. With the same mesh angle on the opposite side of the aviary, you can also simply duplicate the entire group and align it up inside the middle of the girder beam frame. When the central frame segment is complete, all you need to do now is group it up and duplicate the segments until the desired length is reached. In this case, I've marked the top of the aviary to allow about 12 meters on each end for the curved section. The curved section here is the start of the more complicated aviary work this tutorial, but with a few little tricks it can be done in less than 20 minutes. First off, get one side of the central girder beam frame grouped or separated from the central group. Place on angle snap and ensure it's the same height as the central frame. Then turn 90 degrees and align it to the frame to create the middle of the curved section. You then want to place 2 more between the existing frames, each on a 30-degree snap, or turn it twice on the 15-degree snap, like I have. This creates the curved frame pretty easily, and meshwork will be more straightforward because each gap of the curved section is identical. Duplicating the lower mesh wall also works here. Just some editing with the plaster wall length and any mesh that may overlap. Metal rods are then added onto the curved portion of the frame here, and mesh is added from the bottom up. Taking advantage of the leading edge duplication, the mesh can be angled for the next set, filled in and repeated until the top is reached. Choice of mesh depends on the space available, as the further you reach, the smaller pieces of mesh you will want to use. Then group up the mesh and metal rods to duplicate to the remaining curved gaps, ensuring the mesh is lined up with the girder beams to look the Aviary as neat as possible. There we have it, an impressive walk-through Aviary suitable for a proper habitat for really any kind of birds. At the St. Louis Zoo, they have lots of North American wetland birds inside. While lots of aviaries are dedicated to housing birds, that's not the only limitation we have uses for mesh. In habitats of climbing animals, it could be common to see a mesh netting covering the habitat. Animals like lemurs, snow leopards, tigers, monkeys and more might be housed in a netted habitat, keeping them from escaping while climbing on enrichment. One of the examples is Chester Zoo's Madagascar forest, where fossa and several species of lemurs are held in netted aviaries. It is pretty simple in design, and the method can be straightforward or complicated depending on whether you want curved mesh for the realistic touch. Habitat netting ideally should be the first thing you build for habitats needing a mesh covering. It simplifies your work in a shape you can control rather than having to adapt for an odd-shaped aviary, leading to possible days' worth of meshing work. Angled mesh as part of the central nen, like the previous builds, this tutorial, is the first part of this build. Gradually curved mesh creates a nice realistic aviary and can be as big as you want. Some zoos do have some pretty tall netting, but this roof isn't massive, just for showcase, suitable for smaller animals really. Zookeeper metal wire cable is used to line the mesh for a thin, realistic mesh cabling instead of the much thicker metal rods. Netting that features lots of cabling does tend to look more impressive, however you can keep it to a minimum if wished, of course. Curved netting in this central part can easily be duplicated to the length you desire. very much a rectangle shaped netting we're making here. Like the walk-through flood cage, group one of the sides of the cable, the metal cabling, and duplicate it around the corner on the angle snap. We can see doing this creates a nice spread out curved corner, where only one section of mesh will need to be built. Now for curved mesh, it is not recommended to hand lay the mesh like easier aviaries. You instead want to create a surface you can place mesh onto, and the large, primitive rectangle arch shapes are perfect for this. Start from the top or bottom, it really doesn't matter, and align each rectangle to match the cables on both sides. You might need several rectangles, but you will want to make sure you work with one cable angle at a time. Slowly going down, we can see a nice flat surface to lay mesh on. And yes, mesh laying on top of the rectangles is tedious. Mesh is guaranteed to stick out from the metal cables, so don't worry about that. You will want to ensure you have the mesh on a line to surface and making the inside look as nice as possible. In large spaces, use large mesh. In small spaces, small mesh. Keep in mind that every time you reach a new rectangle, you want to jump over to that group to match the new alignment. Keeping the rectangles in a straight slope also ensures each mesh placement will line up to the above or below mesh without much tweaking needed. Once placed all the mesh here, remove the rectangles carefully and group all the mesh together. Then duplicate the mesh section into all the remaining areas of the corner section. Definitely a little more work required in this build, but truthfully this is still not considered a difficult build. Ramping up the difficulty to 10 now, let's take a look at what happens when you have some odd shaped mesh on your hands. It's the same principle of using the rectangle arch shapes to guide you, but it takes so much longer. At the Wilhelma Zoo, they have just that, an impressive modern habitat aviary for bonobos, where it is filled with near impossible odd shaped curves, bumps, and overall pain. As of this tutorial video, this aviary is still a work in progress, as I couldn't finish it in time for a reasonable upload time. But what I have completed basically covers the entire method for dealing with odd shaped mesh, whether it's simple or extremely difficult. So what we have here is a rather odd setup of metal pylon structures to hold up the habitat netting. This is possibly the worst combination a zoo could think of. The pylons are angled in various directions and at different heights, so to figure out the shapes of mesh needed for this aviary, I need to break it up. Zookeeper metal cable is used from the top of these pylons to join to the lower netting boundary I've built as well. Having a series of rough shapes, like squares, allows mesh and focus on a single area rather than getting completely overwhelmed with trying to deal with a huge aviary. The cabling is of course curved to create one of the most realistic aviaries there is on the workshop, but doing so makes this a very long build, likely taking 15 plus hours of work. When the cables are all laid out, which will take quite some time itself, the primitive arch shapes come out and help figure out how exactly does one mesh such an odd shape. It is easiest if the mesh is placed along the bottom of the build area. Alignment along the cables is easy enough here. As the difficulty vastly increases the higher you move up, especially towards the connecting pylon. It takes a lot of trial and error to ensure the rectangles fit alongside the cables and also create realistic curved netting that actually looks like it's being held up by the pylon. Smaller rectangles can of course be used in bigger sections, especially near the top where space is quite limited. Unlike the last build with maybe 10 rectangles at most, this is pretty confusing here honestly. A jumble of rectangle shapes with all sorts of edges need to be filled in with mesh. That's the difficult part. Now for the tedious part. The mesh in here actually takes longer, even though it's simply placing mesh on top of the art shapes. Align to surface and using the advanced movement is absolutely critical for this to ensure the mesh doesn't get mixed up on all these different angles. Fill in the mesh as best as you can. A little overlap on the angles where it disappears into the R shape is actually encouraged, as visible gaps are far more noticeable than some overlapped mesh. You might be lucky to even get large mesh shapes on odd shapes like this. The smallest mesh piece is honestly making up 60% of all mesh pieces on odd shaped aviaries like this. So yeah, mesh work is pretty tedious here. It feels like it goes on forever, but in reality, it could be, say, 20 minutes depending on how good you are at laying that mesh. Another example of impossible mesh work would be the Jamaican modern Aviary complex. While in theory more straightforward than the Wilhelma Zoo Aviary, the twisting curves of this modern frame is really difficult to get around. The frame for the mesh consists of these long, curved metal wire cables, which are then gradually rotated the further down they go. This means every section of mesh is going to be a completely different angle, so tedious is absolutely an understatement here. The method I came up with this style of aviary is place the arch-shaped rectangle along one of the cables. In this case, this is the top cable. The top follows the cable precisely, ensuring none of the rectangles go above the lower cable. Once the top rectangles are all placed, then arch shapes for the lower ones are placed, creating a nice smooth slope. However, there's a problem. The lower rectangles fail to match the upper rectangles when they climb up to the top of the aviary. So get duplicate and advanced mover rectangle to fill in the step gaps as smoothly as possible. Once that's done, all you need to do is fill in the mesh on all the different arch shapes. This one is much easier compared to the previous aviary since the work is done in a much wider space. Remove all those rectangles now, and there we have it, one beautifully curved mesh section. So that's the mesh aviary tutorial, all complete with quite a lot of the aviary designs covered. Hopefully some of us learned at least something from this tutorial, which I'll be extremely pleased if you did. Thanks for watching everyone, and see you next time.